The day the men from the valley rode up the ridge to mock her, the widow had already stacked 2 rows of logs chest-high, her cheeks wind-burnt and her palms split from the hatchet handle. She didn't look up when they came, just drove another iron nail into the joint. The sound echoed off the mountain walls, louder than their laughter. Snow still clung to the pine needles and the earth was frozen 2 inches down. She built anyway. They called her Mountain Mary before they knew her name, and after they learned it they used it less. Mary Barrett was what she'd signed on the land claim, but no one in town said it with respect. She was 36, recently widowed and carrying no children. She had arrived from Kansas with a mule, a wagon missing a wheel, and 2 crates of dry goods. The wagon axle broke 2 miles from the last homestead, and she walked the rest of the way up with rope lashed across her chest, dragging planks and flour sacks behind her. They told her it was foolish to go that far up into the mountains, that the winters were unpredictable, that no woman could live alone up there, that she should try to marry again or at least settle in the flats like the others. But she didn't want flat land. Flat land got overrun fast. The ridge she'd picked sat above a valley basin where families had built clustered cabins, close to the river and each other. A safe choice, until you realized how quickly wind tunneled through there. Mary had found an old line of basalt bluffs, one edge of the mountain that curled in like a shoulder, offering natural cover. There was a spring that ran down through rock, and she dammed it already with stone and mud, slow and crude, but enough to fill 3 buckets a day. The first cabin wall she raised alone in silence. The second, in the shadow of townsmen laughing on horseback. "Shoulda waited for spring, ma'am," one man said, tugging his gloves higher. "Snow'll catch you dead come January." "Can't raise a roof with just stubbornness," another called. She didn't answer, but her hammer did. It hadn't always been like this. 6 months earlier she'd had a husband, 2 pigs, and a patch of land in Kansas that never quite turned green. Noah had believed in the promise of westward land claims, free homesteads if you built fast and held through winter. They left in spring with wagons full of seed, tools, and hope. But a fever took him just over the Colorado border, 3 days of sweat, then silence. She buried him under a lone tree, marked with the brass end of a rifle barrel. She didn't cry much, just waited for morning, saddled the mule, and kept going. The mountain ridge was never their plan, but it became hers. By mid-November her roof was on. The walls were chinked with mud and straw. Inside it smelled of pitch and iron and smoke. She de-built a stone hearth from scavenged rock and rigged a chimney pipe up through the rafters. It smoked a little too much, but it worked. She dug shelves into the earthen wall where flour and beans waited in sacks. Outside she built a windbreak with pine trunks laid horizontal, angled to the slope. She cut down deadwood, stacked cords 6 rows deep. The firewood alone had taken her 3 weeks and left her walking crooked by dusk. But the worst of winter hadn't come yet. The townsfolk said she was doomed. They said no one could trap game that high up, that the soil was too thin for potatoes, that her roof would blow off or cave in. They whispered she was touched in the head. She didn't hear most of it. She was too busy preparing for the freeze. Then came the first storm. It came sudden and silent, one morning in early December with a sky the color of boiled lead. She woke to a stillness too quiet to trust. No birdsong, no wind, just a heavy pressure in the air as if the whole mountain was holding its breath. By midday the snow came. It didn't fall in flakes. It swirled like flour from a sack, dry and sharp and endless. Visibility dropped to 5 feet. The wind screamed down the ravine and tried to rip the door off its hinges. Mary braced it with an axe handle and weighted it with stone. She stuffed rags in the window cracks. She burned wood fast. For 3 days she didn't open the door. On the 4th it jammed shut from the weight of snow drifted halfway up the wall. She had to shovel from the inside, clawing through snowpack with bare hands and a skillet until she could see daylight again. The snow had buried her lean-to, her sled, her latrine. The world was white and leveled. No tracks, No trees, just smooth, deadly silence. But inside it was warm. Her stove burned steady, the stone hearth throwing heat. The walls held. She hadn't even used her emergency oil yet. Her flour was dry. Her mule was alive. She sat by the fire and drank pine needle tea and waited. 2 days later, she heard the sound hooves crunching ice. The townsmen had come again, this time not to mock. They'd been caught in the same blizzard, only worse. Down in the valley, their cabins had iced over. The wind had whipped through between houses. The river had frozen solid and the fish traps were useless. Children had frostbite. 3 men had lost fingers. 1 boy was missing, presumed lost in the storm. The main trail was buried. The church roof had collapsed under snow weight. And Mary's cabin, high on the ridge, was the only thing visible from the pass. Smoke rising, a sign of heat, of life. They came riding 2 and 3 at a time, faces raw, hands wrapped in rags. They knocked not with arrogance but with fear. She opened the door slow. "You alone?" the first man asked. "Yes," she said. He looked behind him, then at her. "We need help." She stepped aside. Inside they stood in silence. Men who'd mocked her now hunched near her fire. The room was small but warm. A girl was crying softly. 1 man passed out standing up. She dragged him onto a blanket and stoked the fire higher. They didn't speak of the things they'd said, of the warnings they gave. They just watched as she boiled water, rationed beans, and passed around tin cups. By midnight, there were 17 souls inside that cabin. 17 who now understood what she had built. The second night, they huddled in tighter. The youngest girl, no older than 7, curled herself under Mary's wool coat, clinging to it like a mother's hem. The child hadn't spoken since they arrived, lips purple, breath shallow. Mary wrapped her close and fed her warm water with honey, the last she had. She knew what cold like that did to lungs. A man named James Knoll, once the loudest voice against her, crouched by the fire holding his palm to the heat. The skin was blistered, not from the fire, but from days of exposure to wet leather, then freezing wind. He'd lost his boots in a creek crossing when they tried to flee the valley. Now his toes were wrapped in rags, blackening. "You got anything stronger?" he muttered, voice thick with shame. She had whiskey, 2 jars hidden in the dirt beneath a stone under her bed, not for comfort but for infection and courage. She poured 2 spoonfuls into a tin cup, warmed it over the coals, and handed it to him without a word. His eyes met hers just for a moment, and for the first time in weeks, he said nothing. She slept little that night. The floor was crowded. Bodies shifted, murmured, coughed. Her chimney flue sputtered smoke every few hours. She rose to adjust the draw, then fed more pine logs into the flame. The wind howled against the cabin walls, but they held. At dawn, the storm began again. It was worse this time. A second front swept through the mountain basin, stronger than the first. Men who had thought to go back down the slope gave up when they opened the door and the gale nearly ripped it from its hinges. Snow like powder blasted in sideways. 1 man slammed it shut, his hands bleeding from cold, cracked skin. They were trapped. The town cabins below, those that had chimneys left, were iced over, unreachable. A team had tried riding back down the trail to check on the others. They got a 1/4 mile before the white swallowed them whole. They returned with frostbitten ears, and a report that the trail was gone, drifted over and invisible, with cliffs below. The mountains had sealed them in. Mary didn't panic. She measured her stores not with paper and ink but by feel, by weight. Flour enough for 2 weeks if stretched. Salt pork left for maybe 3 days. Beans aplenty. Dried apples, a bag of oats, 2 bricks of hard cheese, and a dried deer heart she'd planned to save for January. Water was fine. Her stone dam still trickled through ice and she could melt snow. She rationed without announcing it. No one dared question her. On the 3rd morning, a man began coughing blood. His name was Edmund Tolley, and he was one of the town's founders. He'd owned 3 oxen, a fine barn, and a daughter betrothed to the local sheriff. Now he was curled in the corner of a widow's mountain cabin, lungs rattling with fever, cheeks flushed too deep to be healthy. Mary boiled pine bark and spruce needles. She ground dried juniper berries and steeped them in cloth. She made a paste from mustard seed and goose fat and rubbed it into his chest. No one else had brought medicine. No one else knew what to do. When he slipped into delirium that night, she sat by him with a damp cloth and hummed a tune she hadn't sung since Kansas, something her mother had used to calm horses. The sound softened the room. Even the children listened. The wind screamed, but inside the cabin they had heat and motion and a rhythm that reminded them of something warm. They started calling her Miss Mary now, with a softness they hadn't used before. By the 6th day, the walls began to sweat. Condensation from so many bodies made the inside damp. Blankets grew heavy. The roof groaned under the weight of snowpack. A crack formed near the southeast beam, above where the fire pit connected to the wall. Mary didn't wait for it to worsen. She took 3 men outside, James Knoll, a rancher named Byers, and a quiet boy named Calvin. She had them shovel the snow down from the eaves while she climbed onto the roof. They tried to stop her. "That's suicide," James hissed. "I built it. I'll know if it's giving." She tied a rope around her waist and braced it on a stump she'd used for splitting. Climbing in snow was slow, but she moved like someone who'd worked every inch of that roof before. Ice crusted her sleeves, and her breath fogged thick. But she crawled flat and hammered new braces into place using salvaged iron from a broken sled runner. The roof held. That night they ran out of pork. Mary made bone broth from a rabbit skeleton and boiled wild onions until the room smelled of dirt and salt. She served it in tiny cups. No one complained. Later, by firelight, a young man named Harris looked at her and said, "I didn't think you'd last a week up here. We made bets." Mary didn't smile. She just said, "Then you lost." Someone laughed, not mockery, but real laughter. The kind that came from hunger and shame and relief all twisted into one. It spread through the room. Even Mary cracked a grin, thin as a nail-head. They slept better that night. On the 8th day, someone knocked on the cabin door. It was just after dawn. The light outside was gray-blue, the kind that comes before storms. Everyone froze. There had been no plans to leave, no sounds of approach, no one missing. Mary went to the door first. It was a woman. Her hair was windburnt to the scalp, her cheeks blistered raw, but she stood tall. Behind her, 2 children clung to her legs. One limped, one cried. "We saw smoke," she said. "Yours is the only chimney left." Mary stepped aside again. They were from the far edge of the valley, a family who had stayed too long in their own cabin, hoping the snow would pass. The husband had died trying to fetch water. The wife had carried the children up the mountain for 3 miles through chest-deep drifts. Inside the cabin, no one argued. They made room. Mary gave up her own bedroll. The boy's foot was black with frost. Mary heated water and sliced onions to wrap it in, then swabbed the blisters with pine resin. The mother wept, not loudly but steady, like a crack that couldn't stop widening. Mary sat with her, not speaking, just present. 2 days later, the snow let up. The sun came out. It reflected off the white like a knife. Blinding, too bright to look at. But the smoke still curled from Mary's chimney, and the roof still held, and 17 people, now 20, were alive because of what she'd built. They took turns outside then, rotating to shovel and gather dry pine from buried stacks. Someone caught a squirrel. 2 men spotted a doe half buried in snow, its body frozen solid. They hauled it back, skin stiff, eyes glassy. Mary quartered it with a hunting knife and salted what she could. That night someone sang. A quiet tune, unfamiliar. One of the children joined in. The noise of it echoed off the stone hearth like a hymn. Mary sat against the wall, hands cracked and blackened with soot, and let it happen. For the first time in weeks, the room didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a choice. They stayed another week. Some were strong enough to try returning to the valley, now that the drifts had softened. They went in teams, leaving 2 at a time, carrying word that Mary Barrett's cabin had become the warmest place in the mountains. Others remained longer. James Knoll, whose hands had healed under her salves. The young boy Calvin, who now helped split firewood without being asked. The mother and her children, who slept near the hearth every night and called Mary Auntie without knowing why. She didn't ask them to stay, but she didn't ask them to leave. By early January, the trail reopened. The valley thawed just enough for travel. Those who had mocked her now nodded with quiet respect. Some asked if she'd help rebuild the church roof. Others came just to leave gifts, a bag of cornmeal, a set of iron nails, a wool scarf. They stopped calling her Mountain Mary. Now they just called her Mary. And when the spring thaw finally reached her ridge, her cabin stood stronger than any in the valley. Because it had weathered more than just snow. It had weathered doubt. It had weathered pride. It had become home, not just for her, but for those who had once laughed and now knew better. Winter eventually loosened its grip, but it never truly let go, not up there. By the 3rd week of January, snowmelt ran thin rivulets along the edge of Mary's stone dam. The ice crust on her water barrel cracked in the afternoons, though it refroze every night. The mountain still creaked in the wind. Pine branches snapped without warning. But now the silence was different. It no longer felt like a threat. It felt earned. The people who had taken shelter with her through the storm began to leave, in 2s and 3s. Some had families waiting, cabins to check, livestock to bury. Others simply couldn't bear to accept charity longer than necessary. Their pride, though battered, still intact enough to send them down the slope with stiff nods and hollow thanks. She never asked any of them to stay. She never asked anything of them at all. But the boy Calvin stayed. And so did James Knoll. Calvin was 14, maybe 15, though his frame was so thin it made him look younger. He hadn't spoken much during the worst of the storm, just did what he was told, fetched wood, refilled water, stood guard at the door like a hound waiting to be useful. After the others left, he didn't say he'd remain. He simply did. Mary noticed the boots first. They weren't his. He'd been barefoot or in rags for most of the winter. But one morning she found him tightening the laces of a scuffed but sturdy pair, too big for him, stuffed with wool. James had given them to him silently, without announcement or ceremony. She said nothing. Later she found Calvin hanging deer meat from a pole without being asked. He didn't look up. "Why haven't you gone back?" she asked him. He shrugged. "Ain't nothing to go back to." Mary didn't press. She just passed him a new length of twine. James, for his part, had changed. He didn't speak as loudly anymore. The man who had once mocked her from horseback now carried logs without instruction, patched a gap in the roof, and kept to himself. Mary didn't trust him, not fully, but she watched him closely, not for signs of violence, for signs of something worse, entitlement. But it didn't come. One evening he stayed outside after dark, repairing a cracked yoke he found half buried near the lean-to. He worked quietly by lantern light. She stood at the door watching him, arms folded. "You planning on staying the whole winter?" she asked finally. He didn't look up. "Don't know yet," he said. "Doesn't feel right to leave." She raised an eyebrow. "You waiting on something?" James hesitated, wiped his hands on a scrap of canvas, then said, "Maybe just trying to earn my way out." Mary didn't reply. She simply closed the door and banked the fire. The weeks passed slow but heavy, like wading through molasses. Without a daily crisis, the cabin returned to its original rhythm: work, silence, survival. Calvin cleared snow from the firewood stack each morning. James felled a dead pine and spent 2 days splitting it down. Mary repaired a broken cupboard hinge, stitched new seams into her one good coat, and restacked the flour sacks. Every action had a purpose. Every gesture was preparation for the next frost. At night they ate together. Not as a family, not as friends, but as survivors. There was little laughter, but there was heat. And sometimes that was enough. February brought ice storms. Not snow, just freezing rain that turned the ridge into glass. The wind howled like it had teeth. One night, a sheet of ice peeled off the slope above and thundered down the bluff. It missed the cabin by 20 yards but shook the ground hard enough to rattle the cookware. James had been out tending to the mule when it happened. He came back limping, blood streaking down his pant leg from a gash above his shin. Mary had him sit by the hearth and boiled clean rags. Calvin fetched pine resin. They worked quietly, methodically. When Mary finally wrapped the wound, James winced but didn't flinch. "You still planning to stay?" she asked. He didn't answer. But he didn't pack either. By March, the thaw became real. Trickles turned to streams. The snow receded from the ridge edge, exposing moss, rock, and the occasional squirrel carcass. The trail to the valley became passable again, muddy and slow, but visible. Visitors began arriving again. First a man with a burlap sack of seed potatoes, then the town sheriff, offering a small bundle of papers and a formal nod. Word had spread. Mary's cabin had saved lives. Now the town wanted her on the church council. She declined. "I don't need a seat at your table," she said. "Just leave me mine." They did. One afternoon, as Mary stood on the ridge splitting kindling, Calvin approached, dragging something behind him in a bundle of cloth. When he unwrapped it, she saw a battered cast iron stove door, soot black and half rusted, but still strong. "Found it near a creek bed," he said. "Looks like someone dumped a broken stove last year." She turned it over in her hands. It was heavy, but it matched the size of her current firebox almost exactly. "You thinking of building a second?" she asked. Calvin nodded. "A side stove just in case, with a hot plate on top too." She didn't smile, but her eyes narrowed with something like pride. "Then we'll need bricks," she said. Together they scavenged. They spent days hauling stone and clay from the creek. They built a mold. They fired it over coals. They forged, tested, and rebuilt. By the time the new stove was done, it stood solid and wide beside the old one, connected to a new chimney line that Calvin helped thread through the ceiling. It worked. Not beautifully, but it worked. James stood by the door watching the smoke rise. "You're turning this place into a fortress," he muttered. Mary turned from the flame, face lit orange. "No," she said. "I'm turning it into something no one else can break." April came with its own cruelty. Warmth brought wolves. The first sign was tracks, wide and deep, circling the mule pen at night. Then the howls. Then finally the remains. A half-eaten squirrel, then a rabbit, then a ragged deer leg found near the water line. James built spikes from old rail iron. Calvin lined the perimeter with wire and scrap metal to clang when disturbed. Mary set snares. She'd hunted wolves before. She knew they didn't come alone. They attacked at dusk. 3 of them lean, gray, and fast. They came silently through the trees toward the mule. The mule screamed. Calvin shouted. James grabbed the shotgun. Mary went for the axe. The fight was short, brutal. The first wolf took a shot to the flank and vanished into the brush. The second lunged for the mule and got caught in the wire snare, thrashing long enough for Mary to bury her axe in its neck. The third retreated. The mule lived. So did they. They skinned the wolf that night. Its pelt now hung over the door. May brought thaw, buds, and a sense of choices again. James announced he'd be leaving soon, heading east, maybe as far as Fort Collins, to look for work and settle debts. Mary nodded. "I owe you," he said, "more than I can pay." "You don't owe me," she said. "You owe the next person you meet who's got less than you." He didn't argue. He just left. Calvin stayed. Later that month, a girl from town rode up the ridge alone. Her name was Leela, 17, wiry and curious. She brought biscuits and a question: could Mary teach her how to trap? "I want to know how to stay alive," she said, "even if no one's around to help." Mary looked her over. The girl's eyes were sharp, her hands calloused, not soft. She agreed. Within weeks more girls came, not a flood, just one at a time, curious, determined, angry at how useless winter had made them feel. Some stayed the night, some stayed for weeks. Mary let them. Calvin helped teach them. A year later, the townspeople started calling it the Ridge School. Mary never called it anything. She just kept building. By the next winter, the cabin had doubled in size. A second room, a loft, a larger woodpile. The stove Calvin helped forge still burned steady. A line of pelts hung outside, proof that she hunted year-round. Smoke curled from the chimney even on the worst nights. And when the next snowstorm hit, one even fiercer than the first, people didn't laugh at the idea of heading up to Mary's Ridge. They packed supplies. They followed the smoke. They brought their children. They didn't mock. They knew better. The second winter came harder, sharper, meaner. By mid-November, the wind had changed direction. It blew not just down from the peaks but in from the west, dragging with it long ribbons of ice that clung to everything: shingles, branches, bone. The snow came sooner than expected, and heavier. It didn't fall lightly or drift pretty like some remembered from gentler years. It came in sheets, heavy and fast, burying the ridge in white silence by the third week of the month. But Mary was ready. The cabin now had 3 rooms, a heavy stone foundation, and a double-wall system insulated with straw and sawdust. A design she'd rigged from the memory of an abandoned hunting lodge she'd once taken shelter in as a girl. Calvin had helped lay the logs by hand, wedge each crevice with wool scraps, seal every joint with pitch until the entire structure stood like it was meant to be there. She called it the cabin still, but folks had begun calling it something else. The ridgeold. Because it held through everything. By now, families from the valley no longer waited until the last minute. They began preparing early, weeks before the snows. Some sent runners to Mary asking what kind of chinking she used. Others asked if she might sell any of her spare dried meat or teach them to cure fat without spoiling. She refused money, but not trade. A widower sent her 2 barrels of salt in exchange for lessons on storing root vegetables. A young mother brought half a year's supply of yarn, dyed and spun by hand, just for one afternoon of learning how to set traps for winter hares. Even the town preacher's wife came up the ridge one day, panting and red-faced, to ask if Mary could teach her how to keep bread from freezing overnight. Mary taught them all, not like a schoolmarm, not with a chalkboard and lessons, just in the same way the storm had taught her, by doing, by building, by failing, bleeding, and doing again. Some stayed the night when it got too dark to go home. Calvin would quietly set out furs and clear the hearth, no words needed. No one turned away, not anymore. Then, near the first frost of December, a man rode up the ridge who hadn't been seen in over a year. James Noel. He came limping slightly, the same leg that had taken damage during the last storm, but his shoulders were broader now, his face fuller. He dismounted without words and walked straight to the cabin door. Calvin spotted him first. Mary was out back, stacking firewood into the new second lean-to. Calvin approached her quietly, not interrupting her swing, just waiting until she noticed his shadow. She paused, turned. "Who is it?" "James." She set the axe down slowly, wiped her palms on her coat, and walked back around the cabin. James was standing near the front post, hat in hand. His hair was shorter. He looked less like the man who'd once mocked her and more like a man who had spent a year trying to be something else. "Wasn't sure you'd let me back up here," he said, voice low. Mary looked at him a long moment. "You bringing trouble?" "No," he said, "just tired." "Then you can stay a while." She opened the door. That evening James ate quietly beside the hearth, shoulders hunched, eyes distant. Mary noticed the way he looked at the new stone oven, the way he glanced at the extra woodpile, the added shelves, the dried meats hanging from the rafters. "You kept it standing," he said. "No one else was going to," she replied. He looked toward Calvin, now taller, now stronger, now a boy shaped by labor and silence. James nodded slightly. "You've done good," he said to the boy. Calvin said nothing, but his jaw tightened, and that was enough. Mary didn't ask what debts James had paid or what roads he'd walked. She only asked how much he could carry. When he answered, "About half what I used to," she gave him a smaller axe. That winter, something new began. People didn't just seek her out in desperation anymore. They came to learn, to build, to contribute. A man named Darrell from the southern homestead came bringing nails, thousands of them, offering to help expand the side storage in return for shelter during the next big freeze. A mother named Noreen showed up with 3 children and a wagon full of seeds she couldn't plant in time. She offered to cook for them all, and in time, she became the one who kept the fire going when Mary had to leave the ridge. Because yes, now Mary left the ridge sometimes. Just for a day, sometimes 2, to teach in the town barn, to help raise walls for a woman building her own stove, to assist in midwifing when the roads were too icy for the doctor's cart. They came for her not as a curiosity, not as a myth, but as something real, something needed. She was still a widow, but now they no longer whispered it like a failure. They said it like a badge. In late January, the worst storm of the second winter struck. It hit at dusk, no warning, just a shift in the sky, a cold so sudden it silenced the birds mid-flight. The wind screamed louder than any voice, and the snow began falling sideways. The kind of storm that knocks barns flat, peels roofs from homes, drives cattle over ledges blind with panic. The valley cabins went dark within hours, chimneys iced shut, doors froze from the outside in. But smoke still rose from Mary's ridgehold. And they came. One by one at first, then in waves. Entire families crammed on sleds, on mules, on foot. Some carried babies wrapped in potato sacks. Others bore nothing but coats and hope. They came not because they thought they might survive, but because they knew the only woman who had built for this had done so up high, alone, long before anyone thought it wise. Mary opened her door again. They fit nearly 30 people into the ridgehold that night. Children curled 2 to a cot. James rigged an extra stovepipe using spare tin sheets. Calvin organized rotations, who watched the fire, who collected snow to melt, who managed waste. Noreen set up stew with salt pork and carrots that had lasted months longer than anyone expected. Mary stood in the center, not giving orders, just making sure the rhythm stayed right. Because this was no longer just her shelter. It was a lifeline. That night, a boy was born in the back corner of the cabin. His mother was 17. Her husband, 20, held her hand until his knuckles went white. The wind roared and the fire popped, and outside the walls groaned, but inside, a cry rose up that cut through every other sound. Life, new and raw and defiant. Mary helped deliver him. Noreen washed the baby in warm snowmelt. James tore his only scarf in 2 to swaddle him. They named him Ridge. When the storm passed 3 days later, the valley was wrecked. Several cabins had collapsed. The church bell tower had cracked down its center. Dozens of animals had frozen in their stalls. A well had caved in, burying 2 men who tried to reach water in the night. The rest of the valley would spend weeks digging out. but no one who made it to the ridgehold had perished. Not one. In the spring, the valley changed. For the first time, women began building cabins on their own, not beside their husbands' homes, but on their own plots. Ridgehold designs, they called them. Double walls, buried root cellars, stone hearths braced with cross beams. Mary didn't oversee it all. She didn't want to. She had her own repairs, her own plans. But she watched. She listened. And when a woman named Eliza, who had once told Mary she was foolish for climbing so high, finished her own cabin up near the south bluff, she came to the ridge with bread and salt and asked Mary to bless it. Mary laughed, the sound dry but genuine. "You don't need my blessing," she said. "You built it." "But I wouldn't have," Eliza said, "if you hadn't made it possible." Calvin, now nearly 17, began drafting a new room design, something higher up, with a view of the entire basin. He called it a watch room. He planned to build it himself come fall. Mary let him draw the blueprints in her journal. James, still lingering at the ridge, spoke of leaving again, heading toward the new rail lines, maybe finding work. But each time he got close to saddling the mule, something came up. A repair, a visitor, a child needing help with a snare. Mary never told him to stay. She never told him to go. That was his to decide. As spring bloomed into summer, Ridgehold became more than a cabin. It became a symbol. Not of perfection, not of heroism, but of endurance. Of what it meant to refuse collapse. Of what it meant to build something that could stand when nothing else did. The third winter didn't come with the violence of the first two. It came slow, creeping, almost polite, a few soft flurries in late October, a silvered glaze on the water barrel by November. The cold didn't punch down the door this time. It waited, patient, watchful, testing, and so did Mary. But everything had changed now. The Ridgehold was no longer just a cabin, no longer just her own home or even a refuge. It had become a kind of heartbeat for the Highland families, a quiet, consistent signal that someone knew what they were doing up in those cold peaks, not just surviving, enduring, teaching, and in her own quiet way leading. She never called herself that, never stood on a box, never claimed to be building something more than warmth and shelter. But others had started to say it, especially those who remembered the first winter and the way she'd stood in the doorway while others froze in the valley. They came to her still, not with desperation now, but with questions, tools, building plans, children, pregnant wives. They came to learn what she knew: how to pack a roof so it wouldn't sag, how to seal a root cellar so frost didn't bite the onions, how to trap without drawing wolves, how to stitch a wound with steady hands. But what they really came for, and what Mary understood in her bones even if she'd never say it aloud, was this: they came to learn how not to quit.